Firms have outsourced, seeking cheaper labor and lower environmental standards in other countries, or they've moved factories across seas. And this has produced pressures on households in terms of incomes and wages, along with rising medical costs, rising educational costs, and decreases in employer contributions to pension plans. And it's precisely these pressures that pushed many middle and low-income households to go to banks to refinance their homes as a result of the housing bubble. So these households were trying to stay afloat. They were not on a consumption binge. They were simply trying to maintain their standard of living in the face of the declining incomes and rising costs for essentials over the last 20 years. So one of the problems with this, of course, is that these very corporations who moved overseas or who outsourced as a result of not hiring workers in the US or pushing down their wages no longer had buyers for the goods that they sold. And so we saw a process by which corporations, instead of reinvesting their profits to expand output, hire more workers, and create a virtual cycle of economic expansion, instead funneled their money into the financial sector because rates of return were higher. And so the financial sector took these recycled dollars, we could call them bubble dollars, and they lent these funds to the low and middle income households that were struggling economically. And this is really the nexus of inequality that contributed to this crisis. And unless we solve the problem of inequality, we don't diminish the possibility of future crises in the near future. So as you all know, when the housing bubble burst, there were massive layoffs, first in the construction sector and then throughout the entire economy. And as a result, what we have is the most serious and urgent problem of this crisis, which is the widespread destruction of jobs. Now, many of you may be familiar with these data that since 2008, unemployment rates have doubled, but unemployment has not been an equal opportunity experience, as many protesters on Wall Street can tell you. The worst hit have been people of color, single mothers, and youth. So for example, for African Americans have 100% more likelihood of being unemployed in this crisis than do whites. The unemployment rate for single mothers is 25% higher than national rate, a problem that is very serious because 1/4 of all children in the United States live in single-parent households. And finally, youth unemployment is roughly 25%, and for black youth, it's 50%. And one of the things that we know about crises is that the economic deprivation that children experience as a result of a crisis has long-lasting effects. It has effects on their cognitive development, and thus their lifetime earnings, and the effects of long-term unemployment on adults are equally serious. Skills erode over time, psychological effects such as depression, suicide, domestic violence, and substance abuse are serious problems that emerge. Some of these problems really have not been discussed at all during the last few years by politicians, but I think that they are some of the most serious that we need really to focus on. So how do we restore well-being given the problems that we have with regard to jobs? And I would say that the key problem is, and the key problem that we have to address is the jobs deficit, and that is jobs creation. And so how can we do that? Well, of course, some of the proposals that have been coming from some politicians have been, for example, to cut corporate tax rates even further. However, the problem once again is that even if you cut corporate tax rate, corporations are not going to expand output if there are no buyers. This problem has been made more serious by the fact that there has also been efforts to cut the budget deficit. So at the state level, we have seen massive layoffs, for example, of teachers and healthcare workers and so on and so forth. And so this effort to address the deficit in this way is in fact contributing to the crisis. So let me be crystal clear, and that is that deficits are not the problem. That is, budget deficits are not the problem. They are, in fact, a symptom of a problem. Large budget deficits in the United States began under George Bush Jr. with massive tax cuts that disproportionately affected high-income households. The cost of 2 wars and rising medical costs due to a strong health industry lobby all have contributed to the deficit. The current recession, of course, has contributed to the deficit. Deficits during recessions are good policy. They help families who did not contribute to the crisis weather the economic storm. So the question is then, if corporate tax cuts don't work and cutting budget deficits don't work, what should be done? Well, let me just suggest some solutions to you that are being widely discussed amongst progressive economists. And that is that what is needed is to prime the pump. That is, more government spending, but in particular, targeted government spending. And so what we have to engage in is smart economics, and that is investing not only to create jobs, but also to solve a plethora of economic problems that we have in addition to the jobs crisis. So for example, what would we direct public spending at should we make that political decision to do so? We would invest it in, for example, research and development for alternative energy. We would invest it in green jobs. We would invest it in early childhood education. We would invest it in other forms of social infrastructure that improve people's productivity and functioning of households. We would invest it in infrastructure and mass transportation, which in fact has well-known benefits for corporations because they reduce the cost of doing business. The point about this is that deficits can be self-financing, and I often say to my students that if I lent them $10,000 to go gamble in Las Vegas, they might have a hard time paying me back. But if they took that $10,000 and invested it in education, for example, then their ability to pay back their deficits would be much higher. And that's really the issue, is that it is what we spend on that will determine whether, in fact, these deficits are unsustainable. But it is very clear that doing nothing is in fact problematic. That is, failing to address the jobs crisis and failing to address inequality, in fact, will worsen our deficits, not improve them. Why is that? Because as skills erode and people's income earning ability declines, so do their ability to pay taxes, and thus deficits worsen as a result. There are many other solutions that have been proposed. Public employment guarantees, which some countries have adopted. Italy and a number of countries in Europe have agreed that it is better to share the pain of unemployment by reducing all workers' hours rather than shifting the entire burden to just some workers. So of all of these solutions, I think that there are many that we could agree on. But the point that I want to make to you is the following, that inequality, as this crisis has shown, is unsustainable. We risk our economic futures if we fail to support children in their vulnerable years and the parents who care for them. Promoting equality, especially through jobs creation, is not only the fair thing to do, it is smart economics. Thank you.